All right, thanks, Warwick, and thank you to the university too for allowing us this opportunity to use this space here today to present the workshop to you. Before I start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet here today, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to welcome any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who might be here in the room, or anyone who's live streaming with us here today as well. So before I start, as all things government, a bit of a disclaimer. Just to let you know that today we are just providing general information and general advice. This doesn't mean that your product will be approved by the TGA. Please read through the materials and everything that we do provide you. Make sure you do understand your obligations under our legislation. And if you need to, you may need to seek independent third-party advice as well. Today, it's just about that general information that we're going through. I don't want the assessors to get a message from you saying, well, Avi said this at the workshop, therefore my product must be approved. So please just be aware of that. So what we're going to run through today is I'm firstly going to run through a bit around the basics of therapeutic goods regulation. Then Bronwyn and Jane are going to run through some case studies that'll take what I've given you in the earlier presentation and just give you some tangible examples, some fairly simple examples around that. And then we're going to open up for some questions and answers. So we'll also be taking questions through Poll Everywhere for those of you who are live streaming, but those of you in the room as well, if you want to use that app to submit questions, then we'll take those as well. We're unlikely to be able to get through all your questions, but we'll pick some topical ones from the Poll Everywhere and we'll alternate between the room and that in order to answer questions. After that, we'll have some afternoon tea, and for those of you that have registered for particular product focus groups, we'll break out into those sessions after that. The live streaming will actually end after the Q&A session today. So what is SME Assist? You might already know a little bit about the service that we offer, but in essence, it's a service tailored not just to small to medium enterprises, but also to startups and researchers and anyone who's actually unfamiliar with therapeutic goods legislation and regulation to get a basic understanding of what it is that is required if you're planning on supplying a therapeutic product here in Australia. So we have various sets of tools, from simple guidance through to interactive tools that will help you understand whether you have a therapeutic good or what class of device you've got, or assistance with clinical trial information, all the way through to phone and email support as well. And on our website, we have a subscription service. So when things change, or if new workshops like this are being run here in Sydney or anywhere in Australia, then you'll get an email telling you of any additions to the services that we do provide. So really today, as I said, what I'm going to give you is just a broad overview of therapeutic goods regulation, what it is we do and some of the things that we don't do, and then also some tips and some tricks around where to go on our website to get more information. I appreciate our website is quite complex. It is a difficult website to navigate. So today we'll give you some basics around how to help navigate that and where to get key information that you might need. So onto the basics. Pretty much everyone in this room will be in one or more of those categories in regards to the therapeutic goods environment and the health environment here in Australia. At some point in time, I'm sure we've all been patients or customers in the health space, but for those of you in the room here today, you're also looking at playing other parts within that environment. And today what we're going to look at is covering those areas that I've just highlighted there in yellow, and give you a bit more information because you're likely to be in one of those areas and operating in one of those spaces. So what is the role of the TGA in all of this? So our role is to regulate and monitor all therapeutic goods in Australia to ensure that they're safe to use and do what they're intended to do. And the mandate that we get to do that is under the Therapeutic Goods Act, and underneath that is a set of regulations as well that apply to how we operate. Now, one of the things you'll notice as we go through these slides, for myself, Bron, and for Jane, is there'll be a little information sign in the bottom corner of each of the slides. Now, when you've got that open on your computers, if you click on that link, it'll actually take you to the relevant information, either on our website or a government website, to the information that's on that slide. So that particular one's actually going to take you to the Therapeutic Goods Act, so you can find it a lot easier. So keep the slides handy as well when you're back at your offices or at home, and use those links to find the relevant information. Today, we're only going to go through these slides fairly quickly, so it's good for you to then spend some time actually looking at what's behind these slides in those links. So I'm just going to run you a little video now, and aside from the fact that our marketing team love us to play this, it does actually show what it is we focus on at the TGA.
On any given day, our work benefits the health and well-being of every Australian. Whether using vitamins or medicines, or receiving a cutting-edge medical treatment, we're here to make sure health products are safe for you to use. Whether you need a transplant or an implant, need a blood transfusion or a vaccine, whether you're creating life or living life to the full, we make sure products are safe, high quality, and do what they're supposed to. We keep an eye on medicines, and if we find a problem, we'll tell you. It's nice to know that someone's looking out for you to help you get well and stay well, because we're for the better health and well-being of all Australians through regulatory excellence. We are the Therapeutic Goods Administration.
All right, so aside from being quite a good video, the reason I like to show it here is that we play two parts. So while we are here to regulate the medicines and ensure that Australia gets high quality medications for our people, the important thing to remember is we are also focused on the safety of the consumer and the safety of every Australian when they take medications. So when TGA has approved a product, the public generally rightly make that assumption that it will be safe and work in the way that it's intended to be used. So we take that very seriously, and you'll hear that throughout the whole workshop today around how we assess and the things that we look at and the reasons why we're doing it. So it is important, even though it is a video, it is quite important in terms of the messaging that it does provide. So what do we mean by therapeutic good? Well, a therapeutic good to us is something that is used for either preventing, diagnosing, curing, alleviating a disease or an injury, influencing, inhibiting or modifying a physiological process, something that does testing for a disease or an ailment, something that controls or prevents contraception, testing for pregnancy, or something that actually replaces or modifies any part of the anatomy. And when we talk about the regulation and therapeutic goods, we generally break them into three main areas, and that's medicines, biologicals and devices. So for medicines, we mean what you would expect in terms of prescription medicines, over-the-counter medicines and vaccines, but we also regulate complementary medicines, and that can be a little bit different to some other countries. Not all regulators that are equivalent to the TGA do regulate complementary medicines, but we also regulate blood and plasma products as well, so that's something to be aware of. In terms of biologicals, then we would regulate biologicals that contain human cells or tissues, or they might actually contain live animal cells, tissues, or organs. In terms of medical devices, generally these are devices that have a physical or mechanical effect on the body or are used to measure or monitor the functions of a body. Interestingly enough too, where something doesn't logically fit into medicines and biologicals, we may actually classify that as a device. So disinfectants, so hospital-grade disinfectants is a good example. We would look at them when we do look at them under devices potentially as well. So if you're unsure about whether what your product is actually a device or a medicine, one of the interactive tools we do have on the SME Assist page is my product a therapeutic good? And when you run through that, it'll give you an indication of where your product sits And then behind that, if you do think it's a medical device, we also have a decision tool that will tell you what class of device you're likely to have as well. So encourage you to go in and have a look at that if you're unsure. So what are some of the things that we don't do? So we don't regulate veterinary medicines. We don't regulate health professionals, health insurance, food, or cosmetics and chemicals. They're actually regulated by other government agencies, both at the Commonwealth level, but also understand that if you are operating in a particular jurisdiction, that there may be state laws that will also apply to your product on top of the regulations that we would provide at the Commonwealth level. So make sure you understand where it sits, especially if you've got a product that might be therapeutic, but also whether or not it's a cosmetic, if you're unsure. So you will need to talk to the relevant peak bodies around that. Some of the other things we don't do, so we certainly don't research and develop therapeutic goods. We don't provide clinical advice to individuals. We do get questions on it. So through our helplines and so forth, the TGA does get asked about that. The other important thing that we don't do is we don't recommend one product over another. So once we approve a product, we're agnostic in regards to recommending one over the other. And we also don't consider the cost effectiveness of a product. And by that, what we mean is there is no assessment to do whether it's a viable or a commercial product, whether it will make any money or whether you will sell even one. Is not something that we will determine. Our approvals are not based on any of that. The other important thing to understand with the TGA is while we are part of the Department of Health, approval of a product does not mean that it will get government subsidy on the PBS, on the Pharmaceutical Benefit Scheme. That is a separate process to actually get approval for that. It can be run in conjunction with your application to the TGA, but approval by the TGA doesn't automatically guarantee that you will get approval for subsidy from the government. So in terms of the product life cycle, and this is very high level, this is really just to show you where it is that you will start to interact with the TGA in your product life cycle. Now, if you're in the early stage clinical trials, pre-human clinical trials, then really there's very little to no involvement from the TGA in terms of that process. We get involved when you start to look at human clinical trials, especially where you're doing that with an unapproved therapeutic good. Then the other boxes that are in blue there is really where we get involved in the process, which is around your application to us, our assessment of that application, and then once it's approved, we do continue to monitor and regulate the product even after we've approved it and you've got that product out in the marketplace. And we'll talk a little bit more about that throughout the session this afternoon. Finally, as I said, in terms of the subsidy piece, the Department of Health through another area does get involved, but it isn't something that approval from us will provide approval on PBS for you. So firstly, in terms of the clinical trials and when we do get involved, when you do reach the human trial stage, then for your unapproved therapeutic good, there are two pathways that you will take. It's either a clinical trial notification pathway or an exemption pathway. And in essence, the difference between those two and how you would apply to the TGA to get those approvals under those schemes depends on the risk of the product that you're actually looking at. Again, we've got a couple of decision trees on the SME Assist page to do with notifications and exemptions for clinical trials that'll assist you to understand which sort of application might need to be used, but also understand that that's the sponsor's responsibility to actually put that application in. I'll talk about that in a minute. Notification is lower risk, exemption is higher risk, and we will do a little bit more of an assessment if you have to come down the pathway of applying through a clinical trial exemption process. The important things to understand is that when you're setting up your clinical trials, that you need to do that in accordance with the International Council for Harmonisation of Technical Requirements for Pharmaceuticals for Human Use. Make sure you understand the guidelines for good clinical practice and also the national statement on ethical conduct in human research. The other important thing is make sure that you have a strong human research ethics committee set up that really understands the environment that you're doing those clinical trials in, because they are the ones that they're going to give you that advice, and they're the ones who are going to monitor and help set up the testing program for you. So make sure you've got people with the key skills when you do set that up. So this next slide really just touches on the 4 main areas in terms of clinical trials. I'm not going to talk through it a lot because, as I said, TGA doesn't really get involved in this clinical trial space to a great extent, other than the 2 approval schemes. We do have a handbook on our website that, again, if you use the information link at the bottom of that page, will take you to it, that will give you more information in regards to clinical trials and the role of the TGA. If you're interested in understanding more about clinical trials outside TGA's role, then please refer to the NHMRC, because they have clinical trial guidelines on their websites as well. So if we come back now to the product life cycle, I'd like to just run through the application process and what we need to do to get a product approved on the market. So from our perspective, when you get approval from us, the term that we use is market authorization. And the 3 steps in that market authorization process are pre-market, processing, and then post-market. In terms of pre-market, what we actually mean for that is getting all your data and your evidence together and providing that submission to the TGA. The processing is the processing of your application and making an assessment on whether we will approve that product or not. And then post-market is about your obligations once it's approved and your product is registered with us, and you start supplying that in the marketplace. So that's just a breakdown of the terminology that we use for that. Once you get market authorization, it's then the approval for you to supply that good in Australia. And be very careful about what we mean by the definition of supply as well, because supply means sale, exchange, gift, lease, loan, hire, or even hire purchase. So if you've got a product that fits the definition or is likely to fit the definition of a therapeutic good, and you decide you want to supply it for free and give it away, whether it be samples, you are still going to require market authorization in order to do that. So you will need to put an application to the TGA and get that approved. So it's not just about sale. So even provision of samples and so forth could mean that you are under our regulation. So you do need to check with us on any of that. There are some minor areas where you don't need TGA approval, and that's under our special access schemes. But that's obviously not something that we're going to touch on today. Generally, that's where the product isn't available here and you get a prescription, for example, from your doctor to be able to import that product for personal use. So we aren't going to touch on that in a great amount today. So as I said, in regards to the market authorization, if you want to manufacture, import, export, or even arrange import, export, or manufacture of a therapeutic good, then you will need to apply to the TGA to get market authorization or to get approval. When you do get that market authorization, then the terminology that we use is a sponsor, and you will be considered the sponsor for that product in Australia. You need to understand what the responsibilities are for you as a sponsor. So they don't end once we provide the approval. As long as that product is being supplied in Australia, there are responsibilities that you will have as the sponsor, and we will hold you accountable to those responsibilities and any financial liabilities that occur with that. If part of your manufacturing process, for example, is overseas, and there is an issue, let's say contamination, with that manufacturing process overseas, we hold you responsible here in Australia. You can't actually tell us, not your issue, it was a manufacturing issue overseas. So that's an example of that. Because you are the Australian supplier of that product, you will be held responsible. Some of the financial things that might happen, I don't want to scare you here, but for example, if there needs to be a recall, where the product needs to be recalled off the market, the financial responsibilities are yours, even if we request you to do that. So just be aware of that your responsibilities and our regulation doesn't end once we approve that product. So what are some of the things that we've got in place that will help you with that market authorisation process? Probably the key thing that we've done over the last couple of years is actually look at what we call comparable overseas regulators. And this is where we acknowledge that very often products are already in a market, either in the US or in Europe, and they've gone through an assessment process, looked at the data and looked at the evidence, and they've approved that product overseas. We will actually, from certain countries, and that's the comparable overseas regulators, look at the evidence, look at the data, and look at what they've assessed in making their approval to help us in making our assessment and our approval here. Approval overseas doesn't automatically mean that we will approve it over here, but with the comparable overseas regulators, and we've listed them there for medicines and for medical devices, we've done an assessment, and these countries actually have very similar assessment processes to us. So the evidence and the data that they're assessing is similar to what we would accept. And so to help streamline the process and to make it easier for all of you, we will accept their assessments as part of our assessment. The other thing we've done over the last 2 years is we've introduced 2 new pathways, and that's what we call the priority review pathway and the provisional approval pathway. Now, these pathways are to allow certain medicines, generally medicines that are life-saving drugs that aren't available to patients here in Australia, to go through an expedited pathway and get approval sooner. The priority review pathway will provide approval and full market authorisation earlier, and generally, a few cancer drugs, for example, have gone down this pathway. The provisional approval pathway is similar, but generally what it means is we will accept a product based on early human clinical trials for what we would call basically an interim approval to allow the product to be administered here in Australia to certain cohorts of patients, but on the condition that a full application will be made within a certain period of time and approval will be granted at that time for full use of that product. Again, they're just predominantly for life-saving drugs that we want to have Australians have access to a lot earlier than the normal process. So once we provide you with market authorisation, then your product will be registered on the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods or the ARTG. So that generally will then hold all the information for you as a sponsor on the ARTG, and then you can go ahead and start supplying that product. When you do register your product, the important thing to remember that each product, separate and distinct, needs to have its own registration. I won't go into a lot of detail on that because those 3 links will take you to what that means. And by separate and distinct, we do mean that if you've got the same product but it's got a slightly different formulation, then it may require you to have 2 ARTG entries, for example. So a very simple example would be John in Victoria is currently the sponsor of a product, and Anna also wants to supply that product. Anna has 2 choices. She can ask John if he's willing to allow her to be a retailer, or she will need to apply to provide that own product. But in order to do that, it has to be separate and distinct. And the way that Anna might do that is actually have a different name. So it could be exactly the same product, but with a different name. And again, though, she would need to get approval from whoever the manufacturer is or whoever was supplying John. There's other things that need to be taken into consideration outside of what we would do at the TGA. But from our perspective, to approve that product, it needs to be separate and distinct if both John and Anna want to provide the same product here in Australia. When we do assess a product, the important thing for us is we weigh up the benefits against the risk. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the product is safe. There are a lot of medicines that wouldn't be considered safe. Oncology drugs are not necessarily considered safe. but the benefit of those drugs outweigh those risks. And that's an important thing for you to consider when you put your application into us as to the benefits of your product versus the risk if you're looking at high-risk products in particular. And obviously the level of data and evidence that we require is greater if it's a higher risk product. From the medicines perspective, we have 3 broad categories that we look at. So your product's either listed, which is a low risk medicine, assessed listed, which is higher risk, but not necessarily as high as what we would call a registered product. Generally, your registered products are your prescription medicines, for example, and your listed products would be your complementary medicines. This table here just outlines very briefly where they might sit. So prescription, always registered. Complementary medicines are mostly listed. Very similar process in terms of risk versus benefit for devices, but we call them classes of devices. So class 1 up to class 3, as well as active implantable devices as well, are up on your higher risk classes. So in terms of what we do and how we regulate it, as I said earlier, our role doesn't end when it's approved. So in terms of your marketing, your supply chain, any adverse reactions, any manufacturing that might be done overseas, or any other issues that you might face with your product while it's being supplied is all something that we oversee and we regulate, and we will continue to monitor those products out in the marketplace. We have a fairly strong regulatory and compliance framework that we follow, and this is just a high-level overview of the types of things that we do. Obviously, our preference is to work with a sponsor to educate and to guide you if there are issues, but the level of compliance activity that we take all the way up to enforcement will depend on, partially what the issue is, what the dangers are to the public, and also what the track record of that sponsor has in compliance or non-compliance activity in the past. But further details are on our website with regards to that. So I won't go into a lot of detail, but we do like to work with sponsors first and foremost to try and fix the issue rather than taking any more severe action, although we have done, and there's a bit of press around Mundi Pharma and so forth with regards to their advertising and the fines and actions that we've taken against them. So that's out in the public at the moment. And we do publish some of that on our website as well. So that's broadly, very quickly, the types of things that we look at from a regulatory perspective as the TGA. What I'm going to do is just run through some very quick tips and tricks and some links that will help you understand better what your obligations are. First and foremost, for each of those categories that I talked about, we do have their own set of guidance, and this guidance will really help you in putting your application together. So please spend some time in the relevant category for your product to understand what it is we as the TGA will be anticipating and expecting from you in regards to your application process. Key things here to understand is that we have one there particularly for sunscreens, if you notice. So if you are playing in the sunscreen space, please make sure you understand your obligations. The other important one there is the advertising of therapeutic goods. We've just updated our advertising code, so it includes things like your responsibilities around social media as well. So please make sure you understand what your obligations are. And we'll talk a bit more about that in one of the latest slides as well. In terms of our website, where you will find a lot of this information is under the industry tab. And depending on what product you've got, scroll down to prescription medicines or over-the-counter medicines or complementary medicines, etc. And then you'll get further details and you'll be able to find the guidelines that you want or you need. A few additional guidelines that we've recently put up there that might be of interest to you. Medical device cybersecurity. So we are working on the medical software space as well. And these sorts of guidelines will help you for those of you who are working in that area. More information on our comparable overseas regulators, both in terms of prescription medicines and medical devices, advertising guidelines for stem cells and other human cells, and also a paper that we've recently put up in terms of the researcher considerations if you are looking at research in terms of medical devices, if that's your area. The key pages, I guess, that you would be looking at in terms of a sponsor is our business portal. And that can be found in the About TGA Business Services. So the business portal is your main point of interaction with the TGA. It's where you put in your application for market authorisation, where you would look at your clinical trial notifications, you would advise us of adverse reactions, do any general administration with regards to your ARTG entries, and also your contact details as a sponsor, and where you will pay your invoices, and you can review your invoices as well through that portal. So every sponsor needs to have an account with us. So if you're close to application, by all means, please go in and set up an account with us through this portal. We are predominantly a cost recovered agency, so 97% of our revenue is through cost recovery. And so as part of that, we do have fees and charges that we apply to most of our processes. So the difference is a fee is for a service that we provide, and that's generally in the application process, or if we're doing product evaluations, if we do an audit on you, provision of certifications, or for advertising approval. We do charge a fee if we choose to audit you. So just be aware of that as well. So charges are generally taxes that we impose, and for most of you that'll just be the annual charge for having your product registered on the ARTG, and we send out invoices for that. There are a couple of exemptions to the fees. If you've got an export-only product, we generally don't charge a fee for that. But we also have what's known as an annual charge exemption, or an ACE scheme. So when you first register your product, if it's not generating revenue, then you can apply to have those annual fees waived. Now be aware that that only applies until such time as you make revenue on that product. If you decide to stop selling the product in Australia but keep it registered on the ARTG, even though you're not making revenue, the fact that you have in the past means that you're probably not going to be able to apply for ACE because you've chosen to stop generating revenue, but you've decided to keep the product on the ARTG. So just be aware of that. Finally, SME Assist, so we're on the front page. So if you look under the industry section of the front page and you click on the SME Assist tab there, that'll take you to the SME Assist pages where you can get a lot more information around the services that we do offer. But if you need to contact us, we do have a 1-800 number as well if you need to give us a call, or you can send us an email with your query. So for those of you who aren't too sure what you might need next or who to talk to at the TGA, by all means, please contact the SME Assist team, and they will find the right expert or find who the internal person is that can provide you with the details that you want. So on that, I'm going to hand over to Bron. Thank you.
Thanks, Avi. We'll now go through some case studies on the 4 key areas of regulation. And these are market authorisation, manufacturing, advertising and post-market. And I'll run through the first 2 and Jane will run through the second 2. They're about 10 minutes each. And we've designed these case studies to help you navigate the regulatory maze. So throughout the case studies, we've put these icons on the slides to let you know what the content relates to. The one on the left refers to medicines and biologicals. The one on the right is for devices. And if you see the icon at the bottom, it means the content on the slide relates to all therapeutic goods. So our first stop in the regulatory maze is market authorisation. And Avi covered the therapeutic good development life cycle, which involves pre-market, processing and post-market. I won't go into any more detail right now, but you need to know that before you apply for market authorisation, you have to determine whether your product is actually a therapeutic good. So as Avi mentioned, we don't regulate cosmetics or food, so you need to know what kind of product you have. In general, you can search the ARTG, or the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods, for similar products, and you can also look at a decision tool that we've put together called Is My Product a Therapeutic Good? For devices in particular, you can also use another decision tool that we have, which is called What Classification is My Medical Device? You can ask manufacturers about similar products, and you can also look at labels, instructions, and advertising material. If you do identify your product is a therapeutic good, you can proceed with the market authorisation process. And you can look at the Australian regulatory guidelines to see what's required in the application. We have links here to the various guidelines that we have. We have guidelines on complementary medicines, over-the-counter medicines, prescription medicines and biologicals, and we also have guidelines on medical devices. And these are constantly being updated, so it's a good idea to just keep abreast of those. So Avi mentioned earlier that we use overseas assessments where possible when regulating medicines and medical devices. And this is because it reduces duplication of effort when an assessment's already been done outside of Australia. The process for using overseas assessments differ depending on the type of therapeutic good. And note that when we do use an overseas assessment, it doesn't automatically mean that your product is approved. TGA is still the decision maker. So when you're preparing your application for market authorisation, there are two critical areas that you need to take into consideration. The first one is, what does your product contain? And this mostly relates to medicines and biologicals, but it can also apply to some devices that deliver substances as well. So the ingredients in your product determine how stringently it's regulated. Does it contain permissible ingredients? This is a list of ingredients that have been deemed to be of sufficient low risk. Also consider, does it contain substances in the poison standards? And this is another list of ingredients that are likely to be higher risk, could be higher risk. Secondly, what sort of claims are you making about your product? Are you intending to make a general claim, such as helps promote health and well-being? Or are you going to mention a specific disease like diabetes? Generally, we'll regulate a product more stringently if it contains higher risk ingredients or it makes higher level disease-specific claims. And this means that you need to provide more information to demonstrate efficacy. Check the guidelines that I mentioned earlier for the type of information you need to provide about your ingredients and indications. So therapeutic goods must be clearly labelled to ensure that consumers are given accurate information about the product. For medicines and biologicals, labelling and packaging requirements depend on whether the medicine is prescription, non-prescription or a biological. And these requirements are set out in labelling orders, which are pieces of legislation. For medical devices, the essential principles specify the labelling requirements and instructions for use. And the medical device regulations specify the sponsor information that needs to be included with the device. When submitting your application, you'll need to log on to your TGA Business Services account. And note that for medical devices, you need to submit your manufacturer evidence and get your manufacturer approved before you submit your application for market authorisation. And we'll go into detail on that a bit later. So we'll look at a case study now, and this is Alex, and she'd like to become a sponsor for a non-prescription medicine called Omega Breeze. And she has to think about a lot of different things when putting her medicine label together. So we're going to look at creating a non-prescription label using TGO 92, and this labelling order will tell us the core information that needs to be on the label, such as the product name, the batch number and expiry date, the storage conditions, the directions for use, and the contact information of the sponsor. It also specifies how to display information, like the height of the text. So here the OST-L is too small. It should be greater than 1 millimetre. So we've made that bigger. The text must be clearly legible and the label must be durable. Here the use of colour behind the active ingredient made it difficult to see, and that would be considered a breach. So we've changed the colour and that's made the text much easier to read. Our next step is to consider other legislation that may have an impact on the label. So we'll start by looking at our krill oil ingredient, Euphausia superba oil. We must consider if the ingredient itself has label requirements, and we do this by looking at the permissible ingredients determination at the top of the slide. It states that we have to use the warning statement contains crustacean shellfish or derived from seafood. We've already incorporated this on the warning label, and this is enough to satisfy both TGO 92 and the permissible ingredients determination. We now have to include our indications on the label or what the product will be used for. So let's look at the permitted indication, reduces common cold duration. And we need to check the permissible indications determination this time to see if there are any requirements associated with its use. And this is a copy up here at the top of the slide. And it has a few requirements for the label. We need to have a statement that says if symptoms persist, talk to your health professional, and an adults only statement. We've added this warning to our main warning section, and we've put the adults only warning up near the directions for use, making it compliant. So as you can see, you need to consult the relevant labelling order as well as other relevant legislation to make sure that you're compliant. And note that we haven't included everything in this example. There's other legislation that you need to consider, such as the advertising code. So our next stop is manufacturing. And manufacturing is any stage in the production of the good and depends on the type of product. And it can include everything from producing the product and processing the product through to testing and release for supply. Regulatory requirements have to be met when we assess manufacturing processes to make sure that they meet certain standards. The standard for assessing medicines and biologicals is called Good Manufacturing Practice, or GMP. The assessment process for medical devices is called conformity assessment. And both of these have guidelines and criteria that need to be met to demonstrate compliance. For medicines and for biologicals that contain live animal cells, tissues or organs, the criteria is the Pharmaceutical Inspection Scheme, or PICS Guide to GMP. And for devices, it's the Essential Principles. So manufacturers that meet the standards are issued with a certification, and this is the manufacturing evidence that you need to present in your application. So for medicines and medical devices, if your manufacturer is in Australia, they need to obtain a GMP licence from us. They have to submit a GMP application with their details about the manufacturing site. And there may be an on-site inspection, and after that inspection, the manufacturer forwards the details of their GMP licence to the sponsor. And it's the sponsor's responsibility to ensure that the manufacturer has a GMP licence. If your manufacturer is located overseas, the sponsor must ensure the manufacturer has GMP clearance, which is different to a GMP licence. And the sponsor submits this manufacturer evidence as part of their market authorisation process. For medical devices, if a manufacturer can demonstrate that they meet the essential principles, they're issued with a certificate or declaration of conformity. And manufacturer evidence doesn't need to actually be submitted as part of an application for Class 1 and export-only devices, but it must be available on request if we ask for it after the product is included in the ARTG. For other types of devices, the sponsor has to submit the manufacturer evidence through TGA Business Services and get approval before submitting a market authorisation application. So the sequence is different for medicines and biologicals compared with devices. For medicines and biologicals, the manufacturer evidence is submitted with the market authorisation application, but for devices, you submit your manufacturer evidence first, you pay your fee, you get approval, and then you submit your market authorisation application. We have another decision tree that can help you here. It's called Good Manufacturing Practice Application, and it will help you determine what type of GMP application may be required. If your manufacturer is overseas, you have a few different options to obtain GMP clearance or a declaration of conformity. We have international agreements and arrangements with other countries, as Avi mentioned earlier, and for medicines and biologicals, these are called mutual recognition agreements, or MRAs, and there are around 25 countries that are part of these agreements. If your manufacturing site is not one of these countries or you're not eligible for MRA, you have to obtain GMP certification through us, and this may involve an on-site inspection by one of our GMP inspectors. It's similar for devices where we have comparable overseas regulators. So in summary, we accept certification issued by us and from other countries where we have agreements in place. We inspect manufacturers of therapeutic goods to ensure compliance, and these inspections can happen at any stage during market authorisation. Generally, we'll contact the manufacturer and agree on an inspection date, and the inspection might take a day or two. The inspector identifies any deficiencies, and then the manufacturer has to address these and detail any corrective or preventative actions. The manufacturer must agree to have their site inspected if required, and the sponsor must have an inspection agreement in place with the manufacturer. For our case study, we have Susie, and she wants to be the sponsor of a prescription medicine that's manufactured in Portugal. Because the manufacturer is based overseas, Susie must obtain GMP clearance. Her first step is to confirm the following details with her manufacturer: whether the medicine is regulated as a medicine in Portugal, which it is, whether the site has been recently inspected by the Portuguese regulator, and it has, and whether the manufacturer has a GMP equivalent certificate to TGA standards, and they do, and they forward this on to Susie. Susie uses the GMP clearance assistance tool to check the evidence requirements for her GMP application, and the tool guides her to find out more information about her product. She needs to check the mutual recognition agreement list of countries, because if a country is not listed, you can't use that pathway. And while that pathway of mutual recognition is the most straightforward one, you may be able to use other pathways. The tool also asks Susie to check if her type of product can be issued GMP clearance. And she sees that she can get GMP clearance for non-sterile products, such as her tablets. There are 3 options for GMP clearance. The first is the mutual recognition agreement pathway, and you can use this if your manufacturing site is within an MRA country and has been inspected by them. The second is the compliance verification pathway, and you can use this if MRA criteria hasn't been met and the site has been inspected by a recognised regulatory authority. And the third is the GMP certification pathway, which you can use if the other pathways are not applicable and there's no acceptable evidence from a recognised regulatory authority. Susie can proceed down the MRA pathway because Portugal is an MRA country, her product is regulated as a medicine there, and the site has recently been inspected to TGA standards. And note that if Susie's site hadn't been inspected by Portugal, she would not be able to pick option 3 involving a TGA inspection, And this is because we have an MRA agreement in place with Portugal, and we would ask them to perform an inspection on our behalf. We would only perform the inspection if the product was not regulated as a therapeutic good in Portugal. So to proceed down the MRA pathway, the overseas regulator must meet TGA standards for GMP codes and have recently inspected the manufacturing site to TGA standards. Evidence must be current, accurate, complete and translated to English if necessary. Susie submits her GMP application by logging into TGA Business Services, providing the information we ask for, paying fees and agreeing to the declaration. So I'll now hand over to Jane, who will take you through advertising and post-market.
Thanks, Bron. Hi, everyone. All right, so now the goods are on the market, so let's have a look at advertising and what that entails. So advertising requirements apply to all therapeutic goods. It doesn't matter if it's a medical device or a complementary medicine. Some products, such as prescription medicines and biologicals, have requirements around them, which mean they can't be advertised to consumers. So what is advertising? It's any promotional material. So this includes, but isn't limited to, your medicine labels, TV advertisements, and websites, and that includes social media. And advertising is regulated by the Therapeutic Goods Act, the Therapeutic Goods Regulations, and the Advertising Code. So advertising is your responsibility. The Advertising Code applies to all therapeutic goods to some degree. The Advertising Code outlines the key requirements around what you can and can't say in relation to your therapeutic good. So it's a piece of legislation that you really need to familiarise yourself with. And make sure of what you're saying about your product. Make sure that whatever you're saying, you have evidence to back it up. Ensure that you're not being misleading. And don't wait until we get a complaint to be compliant. You can correct your mistakes at any time. And we have plenty of guidance available to help you. So many of the rules, as I've just mentioned, are contained within the Advertising Code. And I've highlighted on this slide some of the key sections that you should familiarise yourself with. We also have specific code guidance that should be read in conjunction with the code, and you can find that on the Advertising Hub. In a minute. Okay. This is a snapshot of the Advertising Hub. So this is basically your one-stop shop for everything advertising. It contains guidance and educational material and also information about complaints and how we handle complaints. It also contains an email address, so you can actually contact the advertising team at the email address shown if you have any questions around your requirements or your interpretation of the code. We also now have a TGA advertising email list, so you can subscribe to that and you'll be notified about any new guidance around advertising, any media releases or web statements. So I'd encourage you to subscribe to that as well. So why do we regulate advertising? Well, a false claim can not only be misleading, but it can also be unsafe. So advertising must be socially responsible. It cannot mislead or deceive the consumer. And you can see at the bottom of the slide there, those two small examples show how bad advertising can actually be quite dangerous to a consumer. So we'll now look at a little case study. This is Dan. He has a listed complementary medicine called Beans Tonic. So we'll now have a look at what he can and cannot do when it comes to advertising on his label. So although this is a medicines label, all the breaches I'll go through apply to any advertising. So whether it's social media or a TV or a magazine article, they're all the same. So here's the breaches and we'll go through them. So the first one, Dr. Seuss loves beans. So the Advertising Code gives information around endorsements. Your advertisement cannot be endorsed either directly or implied by some certain factions such as government organisations or health professionals. So we would consider that a breach. Oh, what's this doing? Sorry. And logos and images aren't immune to advertising either. So that logo at the bottom of indicates that the government endorses the product. So we would consider that a breach. So even though your product might go through pre or post-market assessment by TGA, that doesn't mean we necessarily endorse your product. So we would consider that a breach as well. This indication, this will help beat diabetes. So you can't reference serious forms of diseases, ailments or conditions unless you have prior approval, and we call those restricted representations. So that's defined in the legislation. Generally, it's a serious form of disease, ailment or condition that ought to be treated and managed by a health professional. So that indication regarding diabetes is also a breach. And the last breach relates to that same indication. So you can only advertise indications that are included on your ARTG entry on your label. So because diabetes is a restricted representation and this sponsor doesn't have prior approval, that will be considered a breach as well. So while there are advertising requirements that apply to therapeutic goods, such as the use of restricted representation and Schedule 3 substances, there might be circumstances where TGA will grant approval for advertising. An example of this is in the recent bushfires. In the interest of public health, last month, TGA granted temporary permission to pharmacies to advertise inhalers and puffers that contained salbutamol. So due to smoke and air pollution from the fires, and we also published a blog more broadly on the management of medicines in an emergency situation. So salbutamol is an important medicine for the relief of respiratory symptoms associated with asthma, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease and other respiratory diseases that we'd consider restricted representations. And furthermore, salbutamol is a Schedule 3 product, so it's listed in the poison standard as Schedule 3, which means it can't be advertised normally. So now we'll have a look at a second case study. This is Daphne. She's a sponsor of a TENS machine called the TENS Best, and she has a Facebook page to help promote her product. So here's a snapshot of her Facebook page. So remember that social media platforms do count as advertising. So the claims in the advertisement are pretty low level. They're not suggesting that patients cease their current pain management strategy. The photographs of a generally healthy individual and all applicable warning statements are present. So where's the breach? Well, let's have a look closer at the comments made by strangers on the Facebook post. So comments in social media posts are considered testimonials, and you as the sponsor are responsible for ensuring that all of those comments adhere to the code. So an example is that comments must illustrate typical cases. They need to comply with all other advertising requirements as well. They can't be misleading or deceiving, for example. So the top message, Mr. Bikeman, he's making a simple statement, doesn't really reflect on the product's capabilities, so that's fine. Anna, down below, she was also making a comment about easing pain in a general sense, so that would be fine as well. Then we come to Simon in the middle here. So he can actually see his bones getting thicker and stronger and saying that the product's going to be great to treat rheumatoid arthritis. So unlikely, we wouldn't consider that to be typical unless he's got an X-ray machine at home. And what we'd consider typical would be something more along the lines of what Anna's said about providing pain relief in more of a general sense. And he also mentions a restricted representation, rheumatoid arthritis. The product itself hasn't made a claim or reference to rheumatoid arthritis, and being a restricted representation, that wouldn't be allowed, so we'd consider that a breach. So although the sponsor hasn't made that comment herself, it's her responsibility to ensure that all those comments adhere to the code. So what do you do about that? Well, you can delete those comments. Delete anything that's likely to land you in trouble. You can keep all of the positive and accurate testimonials once you're satisfied that they comply with the code, but it'd be safer to remove anything that could possibly land you in trouble or be a breach of the code. So testimonials must be from verified users, they must illustrate typical cases, and they need to comply with all other requirements. We're looking at publishing some new social media guidance later this year, so if you subscribe to that TGA advertising email list, you'll be notified when that comes out. Okay, so we'll now move on to post-market monitoring. What does that mean? So post-market monitoring is the continued upkeep of your therapeutic good once it's on the market. So as a sponsor, you're responsible for ensuring that your goods remain compliant and report any problems back to TGA. There are a few things to consider as part of post-market monitoring that you'll have to mandatorily report back to us once your goods are on the market. So you need to collect and record all adverse events. The term adverse events here is quite broad. I'll go into those in a bit more detail in the following slides. And for medicines, we also have deficiencies or defects, as well as medicine shortages. And these have mandatory reporting requirements, which I'll also explain later. So we'll now go through the basics of an adverse event for both medicines and medical devices. So reporting an adverse event to TGA helps us understand current issues and prevent further issues with therapeutic goods. So medicines and medical devices have different pathways for reporting, but the concepts behind them are quite similar. So for medicines, we term it pharmacovigilance, and any adverse event reports go to the pharmacovigilance team. Medical devices term it as part of post-market vigilance, and your reports will go to the device vigilance and monitoring team. So for medicine sponsors, it's a requirement that you report to TGA who your pharmacovigilance person is within 15 days of entering your product on the ARTG. You might be subject to pharmacovigilance inspections, and that's where we'll look at your compliance with applicable Australian pharmacovigilance legislation and guidance. We'll typically focus on unusual or potentially serious adverse events or problems where there's high levels of incidences. And we may request information from you. And note that that's a legal request under the Act, so you need to provide that information within a strict time frame. The biovigilance team is who will report an adverse event for a biological to. We perform audits of medical devices to make sure that you're compliant with the essential principles. Reviews can be done following an adverse event, or you might decide to target post-market reviews on a kind of medical device. Medical devices don't require you to nominate a specific contact person, but we'd encourage you to keep your contact details in TVs up to date. Perhaps have a general email so that if someone's away, you won't miss that email from TGA. The device vigilance and monitoring team don't currently go out on inspections, but they may do so in the future. So there are two main concepts shared when it comes to reporting adverse events. You need to collect and report all incidences, both big and small, from the reporting person, and you need to keep all of your records. For medicines, you always need to record 4 main points of information for every report. And for medical devices, the adverse event reporting form will prompt you of the information you need to include, but best practice here is to include as much information and details as possible. So the terminology of an adverse event is really important because this defines what the event is, whether or not it's mandatory to report, and also how long you have to report it to TGA. So if you're unsure of the severity of your adverse event, we'd encourage you to report it, treat it as serious, and report it straight away. So the pharmacovigilance area have 4 main terminologies. I'll read these out with you, so bear with me. So an adverse event for medicines is any untoward medical occurrence in a patient, consumer or clinical investigation which may not have a causal association with the medicine. So this could be an abnormal laboratory finding, for example. An adverse drug reaction is a noxious or unintended response to a medicine with a reasonable possibility that the medicine caused the adverse event. A serious adverse drug reaction is any adverse drug reaction that results in death, is life-threatening, requires or prolongs hospitalisation, results in significant disability or incapacity, or is a congenital abnormality. And a significant safety issue is a new safety issue or validated signal considered by you that requires urgent attention of TGA. An example of this might be finding out that a raw material in your product isn't quite as safe as you first thought. So you must still collect and report for all types, but those last 2 are mandatory for you to report to TGA. We'll now look at devices terminology. An adverse event is an event that led to death, serious injury or serious deterioration to a patient, user or other person. So you can see that's different to the medicines terminology. A near adverse event is an event that might have led to death or serious injury. And a serious public health threat or concern is a hazardous event arising from systematic failure of a device, usually coming from an adverse event or near adverse event itself. Typically, it will be something that we need to act upon swiftly to avoid public as opposed to an individual's safety. And all of those are mandatory for you to report to TGA. So the timeframes will vary depending on the type of the event. Timeframes are strict and they're in calendar days, so that means that public holidays and weekends are included. As an example, significant safety issues for medicines must be reported within 72 hours, and serious public health threats or concerns must be reported within 2 calendar days for medical devices. So how do you report? Well, again, this is different for medicines and medical devices. For medicines, there are 3 main ways to report. You can do it via TBs. You can go onto the website and submit an online form, or you can email to that address shown. Significant safety issues need to be emailed, and medical devices have an online form available through your TBs account. So finally, there are 2 other mandatory reporting responsibilities that you need to be aware of. These apply to medicines. So a medicine deficiency or defect needs to be reported to TGA. We expect you to monitor the manufacture, storage and handling of your product and report any deficiencies or defects you find, even if it's in a single batch. And the medicines shortages mandatory reporting scheme only applies to prescription and some OTC medicines. So this helps us monitor critical shortages of medicines and ensure that Australia doesn't run out of life-saving medications. But you can report anything. The scheme's voluntary, so even if you don't have a prescription or an OTC medicine, you can alert TGA. So that brings us to the final case study. This is Daphne with her TENS machine again, and we'll have a look at how she reports an adverse event. So what do you do if someone reports they've been injured by your medical device? So Daphne receives an email from an affected user claiming they've hurt themselves using her TENS machine. Daphne's somewhat sceptical. How could someone possibly hurt themselves using a TENS machine? They claimed they've strained their wrist. But ignoring that email is not best practice. She needs to report this incident to the TGA as an adverse event. So she goes to the website and she finds out more information on reporting adverse events for medical devices. So her first step is to consider the type of adverse event she has. So medical devices have both adverse events and near adverse events, and these can be associated, caused by or partially attributable to the use or misuse of a device. So an adverse event, if you remember, is an incident that resulted in serious injury, illness or death to the patient, healthcare professional or other person. A near adverse event is similar, except that it could have resulted in serious injury. So Daphne's confused. The complaint doesn't seem very serious. How could someone strain their wrist using her TENS machine? She talks to her friend Susie, who reassures her and tells her that if in doubt, she should just report it. The act of reporting is not an admission of the manufacturer or sponsor for liability of the event or its consequences, and it also doesn't necessarily mean that there's a problem with your device. So together, they look at the TGA website, they follow the guidelines and determine that they have 30 calendar days to report their incident. And she should also let the manufacturer know. So the website prompts Daphne to collect more information from the affected user. So the bare minimum she'll need to include are details about herself, details about the user, the product involved, and details of the incident itself. So she gets back into contact with the affected user, gathers all of this information from him. She now jumps back onto the TGA website, learns that she can access the online form through her TBs account. She refers to the TGA guidance material on how to submit a report through the medical device incident reporting system. And then using that step-by-step guide, she clicks submit and successfully creates a new report for the incident. And this becomes the initial report, as she still needs to obtain further information to make it a final report. She receives a device incident report number, and it's really important that she hangs on to that number because she'll need it later when resubmitting the form. So this is not the end of Daphne's adverse event reporting. Bear with me. Within that initial report, she's prompted to find out more information. She needs to check her own quality management system and her own surveillance practices when she's supplying her TENS machine. She also needs to ensure she hasn't received any other complaints and also check overseas. She might have had some complaints from overseas if she supplies it there as well. She then needs to log back into her TBIS account using that DIR number that she received earlier. After providing that additional information, she hits submit and that initial report turns into a final report. TGA then receives the report and will typically contact the sponsor within 3 to 4 business days, and this is done via email. Typically, there might be further questions for the sponsor within that email. We might want to know the current supply numbers for the device or receive a copy of instructions for use for the product. So Daphne answers all of those questions. She responds to the email from TGA. It turns out TGA has received numerous reports of wrist strain for the improper use of TENS machines. So although nobody's previously had issues with Daphne's device, there's been another issue with TENS machines in general. So TGA has a bigger picture in view. So it's really important to report. TGA informs Daphne that because of a growing number of misuse cases, she needs to update her instructions for use and add the warning statement, do not use on risk, or words to that effect. So that brings us to the end of the case studies. I hope that makes the navigation of the regulatory maze somewhat clearer. And I'd like to invite TGA staff to join us for the Q&A session.
Okay. So we're going to open up now just for a session on questions. We'll take both questions from the audience here as well as we've got Mel over there who'll put her hand up when we've got some questions from the Poll Everywhere app. We've got a panel of experts from the TGA here to help answer your questions. One of the things I'll just get you to keep in mind is, as I said earlier, this is a general session. If we start to go down the path of being a little bit too specific around your particular product, I might just call you back on that and maybe we can have a one-on-one conversation after this, or we need to follow on those conversations after today and we can get your details and do that. We've got some microphones which we're going to walk around the room with. Please wait to receive your microphone so that people who are live streaming will be able to hear your question as well. So I might open up to the floor. Have we got any questions from the floor? Got one right up the back there, Bron. Or Jane?
Thank you. So I'm wondering what would happen if someone on Twitter posts something that will violate the advertising rules, because you can't delete someone else's Twitter tweets, then what would happen in that case?
That's a good question. We would have to come back to you with regards to what happens on Twitter if you can't delete that, whether it would require a statement from you. You might need to put a tweet up to actually say that.
I think we would expect you to take reasonable care and try and get in contact with that person and try and have it removed in the first instance. But we're publishing some more guidance on social media this year, in the next few months, so keep your eyes out for that. And that will include Twitter.
Oh, we'll go over here while you're here and then we can go. Yep.
Another one on advertising. So I noticed when I was looking at the site that pregnancy tests had an exemption for advertising. And I was just wondering why that is, because when I looked at the rules, it was about a disease or a defect seemed to be the classification.
We've got a microphone here. Yep.
So I can't go into a lot of reasons why the pregnancy tests have exemptions for advertising. A lot of it comes back to, we did a big post-market review probably about 3 to 4 years ago now, where we got all home pregnancy tests in to the TGA, and we did a lot of laboratory testing with those. Beforehand, it was very general in the way that sponsors had their pregnancy tests and all of their instructions for use and what claims they made. And we narrowed it right down when we did all of the testing as to how accurate those pregnancy tests would be and what the intended use for them would be. So we wanted to make sure that the consumers were very aware that when you do a home pregnancy test, if it's just a HCG test, that it can't pick up any birth defects. And because previously there were claims made that on some of the advertising content that some of the pregnancy tests could pick that up, we then made a determination that we definitely did not want consumers still thinking that those certain pregnancy tests were actually picking up birth defects. So we kind of had to make a bit of an exemption rule to address some of the wrongs that were done in the past. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, so it's really about what the urine test picks up in terms of accuracy that you have to look at.
Yes, absolutely. So actually a bit later on when I do my talk, my case study is the pregnancy test that we did. So, and in that I'll be going through and I'll be saying how with some of the early response pregnancy tests that at 5 days out from an expected menstrual cycle, that looking at like 86% accuracy, and then they go through and they go down to 4 days, 3 days, 2 days, 1 day, and then the day of the missed period, looking at around 99%. And most early pregnancy tests now do have those percentages written in their instructions for use.
Jeez. My question is, if I'm the retailer of a medical device and I receive a complaint about an adverse incident in relation to the performance of that device, and I report that to the wholesale distributor who's also the sponsor, I as a retailer, do I have an obligation to the TGA, or is that once I report it back to the sponsor, the sponsor has the obligation to file the report? As a retailer, is the onus on me, or is the onus on the sponsor or the wholesale distributor?
The responsibility is 100% on the sponsor. We cannot regulate retailers or health professionals to put in a report at this stage. So therefore, we expect if you have a problem or a consumer comes to you and says, I've had an issue with a medical device, you report it back to your distributor/sponsor, and they must report it to the TGA.
Thank you.
Having said that, we would love you to report it as well.
Oh, okay, so I can still report.
You can still report, yep.
Okay,
so the
right.
general public can report adverse reactions to us because obviously the more information we get, the better.
Sure.
Yep. Why don't we do?
So another one about a new advertising consultation with TGA. So reading through that, I find a lot of information about tagging your company webpage or your company pages, but there is nothing actually about is a company employee can like or share some of those HCP advertising or kind of endorsement. Is that going to be liable for the company? So it's not really covered about the like and share. So
Depends on how much you're relying on that testimonial in your marketing of your product, and that will determine, but yeah, absolutely, it will fall under the code requirements, and you need to ensure that those testimonials or endorsements that you're promoting actually comply with the code.
So in terms of an employee just liking your page,
yes.
That's not, unless it's construed as the public seeing that, let's say you could see the employee's name, they were a doctor, and there was a like and things like that, you need to be careful of that. But otherwise, if it's not something that the public would misconstrue in terms of that like, then it's really up to you as an organisation what your own internal policies are with regards to conflict of interest and things like that. You know, if you tell all your employees so that you get 500 likes, that's really an internal thing for you to have a look at. Our view will be what the public might interpret with that individual liking it, especially if they were a doctor or a GP and they were your employee as well.
Yeah, so you need to consider what the take-out message is for the reasonable consumer from that.
Thank you. Thank you. I can have another question?
Very quickly.
Very quick. Conformity assessment, is that okay?
Yep.
Yep. So if we have a product which is kind of medicine, device include medicine, and we would like to register it is the same everything, but different size. So 1 ml, 1 2 ml, 1 3 ml. So is each size, each volume will consider as new UBI, and it will have a full fee for design examination?
So we do have the definitions of UPI in the regulations, but from what you've just described, just because of the different volume, as long as it doesn't changes the intended purpose of the device, then it will be considered as a term called variant. So you can look that up whether it meets the definition of variant. So that depends on, variance is like, you know, for the different sizes to accommodate the different anatomical positions of the patient, but the intended purpose of the device is still the same.
Excellent. Thank you. Thanks.
Come to you.
So thank you for the presentation so far today. I just had a quick question. It appeared on one of the slides in relation to medicines, but not around medical devices. I suspect it's buried in the detail somewhere to go and look at after today. But the priority review and the provisional approval pathways that are for medicines, is there a plan or is there an existing equivalent for devices?
Actually, we do already have a priority review for medical devices established. So I think you can refer to our website for more specific requirements of how to meet that that application in order for it to be eligible for that application process. So as long as, I think the general consensus is if you have a device that, you know, it's an unmet medical need and they don't have a similar product available in ARTG, then you can potentially apply for the priority pathway. Yeah.
Just right behind.
This might be a simple question, but if you have one product and it's registered 2 or more times, if there's a safety issue, is there notification to all the different products that are registered?
Sorry, I'm assuming you're talking about a prescription medicine here?
Can be prescription, but can also be devices.
So I can answer from the prescription side of things. Yes, we do expect that because usually it might be a different sponsor, and even if it's not, the idea is that the innovator will make a safety-related change and then the generic, for example, should follow suit. And we have implemented a search facility on the web page where you can search changes 2, 5, 7 days ago to make it easier to keep on top of those changes.
And devices?
Exactly the same, yeah.
Yeah, hi there. Thank you for the presentation today. I was just wondering what would be the approximate approval timeline for market authorisation for a low-risk product? Just the average or approximate?
For the listed medicines, like complementary medicines. So if you're just going, we have two pathways for listed medicines now. We do have just the general Austell listed medicines, which is not a pre-market assessment. So you can actually fill in the ARTG, the TBS application yourself, and then get your number, and then you can mark it within a couple of days. But if you go down one of the assessed pathways where we look at efficacy, which I'll cover more in my presentation, then that there is an evaluation timeframe in there. But for your general low-risk medicines that only use permitted ingredients, permitted indications, and are made under GMP, it's a self-certification process by the sponsor.
Just be aware, it is important to understand though that while that is a fairly quick process, at any time we can come back and audit you and make sure that you are actually holding that evidence, even though like we don't require the GMP certification, you still need to make sure you've got all of that. Yep.
Hello? Up the back.
Oh, yep.
Just a question in regards to, we're currently doing research under a GLP environment, looking to move into GMP mid this year, and wanting to know, there was mention about exemption of some fees pre-revenue. If I could get a bit more clarification on that.
So what I talked about was the ACE exemption, and that is once you register your product on the ARTG, there's an annual fee. If you're not generating revenue, you can apply for an exemption to not pay that annual fee. Yep, so that's post, I guess, going through the application process. There's still a fee that you would need to pay to go through the application. It's just that annual charge that we can exempt you from until you make revenue. Yep. Sorry. Okay.
Just a quick question on the medical devices space around conformity assessments. So particularly for software, so SAMD programmables, what's the kind of evidence that we would need to provide or could be provided to show conformity to the essential principles?
So that's an interesting question because we recently undergone the regulatory amendments to address software as medical devices. So we've changed the regulations in December 2019 last year to, there are some reclassifications to address particular medical devices that incorporate software that is intended for diagnosis, treatment, or providing therapy. So that in terms of the level of evidence that comes back to the risk classification of the device and the intended purpose of the device and which classification it meets. So the level of evidence will be, the requirement will be higher according to risk classification. Does that answer your question?
Any examples given, is it around the software practices? Is it around so if you've got a pure software product?
As in say like a
mobile
medical
app or
yeah. So it comes down to what's the intended purpose of the mobile app. Is it intending to provide a therapy or monitoring a disease or providing a diagnosis? So, and also when it comes to diagnosis, you also have to consider the consequences of, if it's a misdiagnosis, what will be the outcome of that? So, the outcome of misdiagnosing cancer will be different to flu. So, and the risk classification will be different, depends on the intended purpose of that app as well.
Is there somewhere that a mapping or a document that might allow us to
Yeah,
see
so
that?
we do provide, we did publish a web statement on the summary of the regulatory amendments that we've made in December. And we do have a digital health team in TGA, and we're working on providing a more detailed guidance document with specific examples, and it should be come up in the next few months. So we're working on that.
Great, thank you.
Got an online question or a poll?
Thanks, Avi. So the question is, does TGA conduct assessments themselves in-house, or is work contracted out to external groups similar to MSAC?
For most applications, we do internal assessments, but there are times where we have a panel of experts in very niche therapeutic areas where we almost have to go out to these type of specialists, and that we call those external evaluations, and there are a certain protocol and eligibility criteria and who and how long those evaluations take, but the delegation still sits with the TGAs to make that decision, so they really do use that as advice.
Just a quick question on, I think it was similar to the first question about retweeting, reposting and sharing. So if a company, puts out a social media post or announcement and then the employee on-shares or retweets or reposts, is the responsibility still with the sponsor?
In a nutshell, yes.
For any comments that may come back? Right.
Yes, so the responsibility
Still
lies
monitoring
with the sponsor to monitor that.
Yeah.
And make sure, look, are you going to capture everything once it's out there?
Yeah.
Probably not.
Yeah.
But we need to be comfortable that you're actively monitoring it and doing things about it.
Sure.
And also that you are, when you do know of something, that you take appropriate action in a timely manner. So, you know, if someone like Simon's post was left up there for 20 days
Yeah.
and then deleted, we may not consider that being done in a timely manner. So, yeah, we may come and ask you further questions around what you're doing to actively monitor.
Sure, thank you.
Yep.
When it comes to social media, generally speaking, is there anything that you can disclose or let us know about what's going to change soon? Because we know that it's a big trend now, and there's a lot happening in social media, so that will be really important for us and for me as a company.
So I think the key thing is just keep an eye on the on our pages, our advertising pages and things as well. So anything that we've got coming up and changing from our side, you can become aware of. Yep. Sorry.
Hi. Thank you for interesting session. Just quick question around MRA with other countries. We've got the product to introduce from Japan, and Japan is one of the countries where MRA can be applied. And just wondering whether we could just submit all what we had in Japan in Australia, or we still need to add some of the data, clinical data, on top of the bridging data, which could be leveraged for the application.
So I think in the presentation earlier, we've highlighted about the comparable overseas evidence. So Japan is considered one of the comparable regulators that we consider the evidence provided from them. So it depends on the risk classification of the device again, and we do consider some of the approval from Japan as an comparable overseas evidence. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
So I think the important thing for you to understand is one of the earlier slides had a list of all the guidance documents. So, for example, for devices and for prescription medicines, those guidance documents actually provide you with the details around the evidence that we require. So if the evidence that was submitted in Japan doesn't meet all those requirements, then yes, you will need to submit further evidence to us. The comparable overseas regulators are a process to allow us to streamline and simplify, but we will always retain our sovereign right as a Commonwealth entity to make our own decision. And so we may require further information. Have a look at those, because if you submit only what was submitted in Japan and it's not enough evidence, we're going to be coming back to you and it's going to be a longer process.
I guess it depends also the product.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Great. We've got a gentleman here. You had a question? Yep. Sorry. Oh, okay. Yep.
It's just a question in relation to medical devices. There seems to be, for medical devices where some companies have registered them and they're listed on the ARTG and others haven't and are perhaps relying on the custom-made exemption. Is there somewhere for consumers to go and search? They might search for the company and see that they're not listed on the ARTG, but want to make sure that they're using something that has been determined that it is custom made.
Sorry, I didn't quite get your question about the custom made pack. Could you repeat that again?
So for medical devices, where if you're a consumer and you're going to use a medical device and you want to make sure that it's safe to use, and you see that, you know, one company has it listed on the ARTG but the other company isn't listed, is there a list, you know, that a consumer can go to check to see if it's on the custom-made medical device list?
So I'm not aware of a custom-made medical device. Now, obviously, I'm aware of there are surgeons or particular hospitals who might make certain tweaks to a device, let's say the size of a hip implant, or they might need to tweak some sort of software to do with a pacemaker. In those instances, the underlying product will have been approved by the TGA and they're just modifying it for that individual. They're not changing the purpose for which that device was improved or intended to be used for, so we don't generally get involved in that. Unless you're talking about 3D printing in
Yeah.
terms of, oh, you are. So we do have regulations in regards to 3D printing.
Yeah, so in fact, we recently changed the definitions of custom-made medical devices in the regulation. So now we're trying to narrow down. So in the current process, custom-made is included as class 1 in ARTG. But as you know, with the technology evolve, so we notice we are not capturing the risk of those large group of so-called custom-made devices. And now we have refined the scoping of custom-made devices, and we also introduced new terminology such as patient-matched and adaptable medical devices, which could be all associated with 3D printing. So with our new definitions of custom-made, it's a device that is a design that's provided from the surgeon to the manufacturer to produce, and and they don't have a similar product available on the market. So we currently, as part of the regulatory amendments made in December, we've introduced new terminologies of custom-made, patient-matched, and mass-produced devices to address this. So I'm not sure.
Okay, I'll check them out. Thanks.
Yes.
Hi, my question is regarding adverse event reporting. What do we do in the situation if, as a sponsor, you receive word from a healthcare professional about an adverse event, but when you try and get the 4 main pieces of information, they become uncooperative? Like, what do you do in that situation?
We get this quite often, actually. A lot of the time, surgeons don't want to hand over patient details, and that is something that we ask for on our adverse event reporting page, especially for medical devices. If the healthcare professional doesn't want to hand over any details, ask them if they're happy for you to put down their information as the initial reporter, and ask if they're happy to be contacted by the TGA, because sometimes the healthcare professional doesn't really want to give out a lot of information through to a sponsor, but they're quite happy to give it over to the TGA because we're still working under the Confidentiality and the Privacy Act. So we'll treat all of the information that comes from the healthcare professional as confidential. If you can't put in your adverse event report due to a mandatory field that you just can't get the information from, the best is to email us. And for medical devices, our email is iris, IRIS, @health.gov.au, and just let us know that you have an adverse event report that you want to submit. However, you can't fill out a mandatory part of the form online, and we can actually override it from our end for you. And then when one of our investigators looks at the adverse event report, we may come back to you and ask for information, and you might go, well, we can't get it. Then we will try our routes to actually investigate and see if we can get that information. Sometimes when we do that, the healthcare professionals are happy to give that information over, and then we have to delicately try and let you guys know what actually is the issue with the device, and then we can go through an investigation. If we can't gain any more information, you guys can't gain any information, well, we can't investigate what's gone on. And usually the person that's reported that issue becomes aware that without any further information, no further investigation can take place, and it's their responsibility to either hand over the information or allow the investigation to cease.
Thank you.
And we've got another one from Poll Everywhere.
So the question is, you said some cancer medicines can use the expedited pathway for approval. How do we determine whether the drug is eligible? Is there any guidance?
So most oncology drugs are prescription drugs, and there are there is actually a step before evaluation that is a determination. So there's a list of eligibility criteria and some guidance specifically regarding this pathway. And it's usually, what was mentioned earlier on with devices, that it's an unmet medical need, it's a breakthrough in that therapeutic area, those kind of things. And there is a small fee associated with that. And then the application can be made once that determination is made that it's matching that eligibility criteria.
A question up there.
Okay, my question is relating to adverse events. I'm going to be following up patients who may have had a medical device implanted. So whose responsibility is it to actually notify?
So it is the sponsor's responsibility to notify the TGA of any known adverse events. However, patients, consumers, healthcare professionals, anyone can access a reporting form on our website. So the consumer form and the healthcare professional form are both found on our website. If we get a report that appears to be exactly the same report as the one the sponsor puts in, we will generally close one of those reports as a duplicate, and they won't be counted in further numbers. They also won't be published on our website, the DANE, so that it doesn't look like we're getting more adverse events for a particular device than what, not really, if we've got duplicates.
Okay, and are gold seeds and markers counted as a medical device?
What's that?
Are gold seeds, also called markers, regarded as medical device?
I'd have to look up on the website and go through the little pathway with you to determine that one.
Cool. Just go on here. Yep.
Yeah, with regards medical devices, particularly diagnostic tests in trials, what's the desirability or requirement for a CTN or a CTX, if at all?
For devices for clinical trials, is it?
If you're trialling a medical device, a diagnostic device, does the same CTN or CTX requirement hold as we saw in the pharmaceutical slide earlier by Avi?
Good question. I'm not an expert on the device clinical trial space. We could come back to you on that. We'll have to get your details and then come back to you on what the requirements would be in that. Generally, the sponsor would make a determination on when any notification had to come to the TGA, but we'd have to look that up. Yeah. Oh, Mel's got a couple. Yeah.
Okay, it's on. So this one's a bit of a general one. Where can I find information on what constitutes a therapeutic claim? And there might be another part to it, therapeutic claims and where to find information.
Oh, thanks. Just in relation to that, whether it's for listed medicines or for registered medicines, therapeutic indication is actually defined in the Act to say what that's for therapeutic use, and we define what those uses are. In relation to listed medicines, we have a list of permitted indications for listed medicines, and they're available through the TB's website, or they're also registered in an instrument on Frilly. So they're the low-risk indications that you can use for listed medicines, but if you go up into the evaluated space and to listed, assessed, or the registered medicines, then you put your indication in relation to the product you had and the evidence you hold.
Did you have any more? Do you have another one, Mel? Or?
Yes. So in regards to the new framework for patient implant cards and information leaflets, in Europe, the transition period will commence in May 2020 and conclude in 2024. While in Australia, the transition will conclude in 2021. Can you please clarify the timeframe difference?
So I think with the patient implant card, Australia actually took a step ahead before the EU medical device regulations was introduced. So that's why there's a difference in terms of the timeframe difference.
Another question about the medical device. With the MDR coming, there will be a lot of up classification for some of lower class devices, and also there will be a new devices which we need to register in the market here in Australia, which will be classified as 1R or reusable device. So how TGA gonna kind of align with the MDR timeline, which is coming soon by 24th of May?
So we have to check with you about the transition period, but so your question is specific for Class 1 reusable surgical instrument, is that correct?
So, yep. So if I need to register the new device after May 24, which is classified in Europe as Class 1R, so is that going to be as well 1R here in Australia, or we just use it as Class 1? That's my first question. The second one is about the up classification. So a lot of our product will be up classified from Class 1 to Class 2A or 2A to 2B, which TGA has a guideline on this, but there is no timeline on when TGA expects the sponsor to do the up classification. And is that going to be through variation or new submission?
So to answer the second question first, with the up classifications of software, we actually did mention about the transition period of those up classifications. So for existing devices that are already included in the ARTG, so the new reclassification rules will become effective from 25th of August this year onwards. And for those one already included in the register, they will have a transition period of 4 years.
4 years.
Yeah.
But it's not software. Does that include any up classification or just as a software?
So, we're talking about software as medical devices here. So yeah.
I'm talking about the one which TGA or MDR consider as a borderline medicine. Some of the devices which will need to be up classified because of its indication.
Yep, so those devices would have already been included in the register. So for existing one, they would have already been included in the register as Class 1 at the moment.
Yes.
And with the new rules, they will become effective from 25th of August this year. And for those that are already in the register, they will have a transition period of 4 years.
4 years.
So yeah, so the new requirement will apply to them in 4 years later. But then the sponsor is required to notify TGA about the current ARTG entries. So there is a instruction provided in the web about notifying TGA of like what need to be provided for the notification.
And is there a deadline for the notification?
That's before the 25th of August this year.
Okay, excellent.
Yes.
Thank you. Thanks.
If the sponsor will discontinue the medical device and consume all stocks, can sponsors cancel the ARTG, or do they need to keep the ARTG for a certain time?
No, they can cancel the ARTG themselves. All sponsor-initiated cancellations do not get published on the TGA website. However, if the TGA determines the cancellation, it does get published on the website. The sponsor's responsibility is also, if you have cancelled the ARTG, recalled all of the stock on the Australian market, you must still retain all of your adverse event records and clinical evidence and your design evidence for a minimum of 7 years, because we can still go back and review a device and ask for anything that showed conformity to the essential principles after 7 years or up to 7 years post cancellation.
What is the difference between a custom-made medical device and customised medical device? Can you give examples?
So that goes back to what Avi was saying a little bit earlier, in that a custom-made medical device could be considered a 3D printed knee joint. So patient goes in, gets all of the diagnostic scans, and then that device is 3D printed just for that patient. That knee joint would not suit any other person in Australia. A device that has been customised might be an insulin pump that has got specific settings for a patient's needs, depending on their insulin requirements.
We'll take one more from poll everywhere and then we'll close up. If you've got one.
Yep. Do the same processes as ruled out within the presentation apply for disinfectants and sterilants?
This one is a little bit of a tricky question. So the disinfectants and the sterilants, we actually have done a lot of work doing a TGA therapeutic goods order, which has been published on our website, TGO 94, and you can go and just type that into the search bar and it'll give you all of that information on what your requirements as a sponsor of a disinfectant are.
All right, so I think we'll close up there for the Q&A. I'd like to thank you all for coming here today and taking the time out to spend some time with us. I'd also like to thank everyone for dialing in, or whatever the terminology might be, for coming in online. Today was actually the first time that we've live streamed this session, so for those of you who are online, we would really value your feedback with regards to how this process has worked for you. And for the rest of you in the room too, we would value your feedback as well in terms of what you thought and how this targeted what your requirements were. For those of you who are here, we do have the product breakout sessions that will occur straight after this, and we've got some afternoon tea out there beforehand as well. So on behalf of the TGA, and also thank you to the university, thank you all of you for coming along today.